All right, you ready for more? Yeah, you're right, it doesn't. We might have to look at that even message. That one's borderline, huh? And that's what we're talking about today. Last week was something, huh? Well, we started this series on restoration, and we said it might be one of the most biblical subjects because it's all throughout the Bible. God gives principles, and we stray from them. And so in the Old Testament, you see times of restoration. In the New Testament, since the close of the New Testament to now, we certainly have the Reformation with Martin Luther. And then we have the Restoration Movement, which our church is a part of. Started about 200 years ago. And started off looking at the history there and the achievements, the things that this group has done. But since then, we've looked at what's still left. Why did we stop so soon? What didn't get restored? And we talked about the biblical idea of unity and fellowship, how it goes much deeper than we typically think of. The focus of prayer, we could say that goes much deeper than we typically think of. We focus on physical often, when the biblical focus is on the spiritual needs of individuals and the kingdom. And then we talked about how to study the Bible. And we'll be continuing to do that. Last week, though, was the big one. The worship service. That isn't. That shouldn't be. It is not the worship service. And we said a big part of this confusion is the fact that we have this English word worship, which means to adore, show devotion to. But that's not what the Greek, when you see that word in your Bible, in the New Testament, it's not what the Greek words mean at all. They literally mean to either, there's two words, prostrate yourself on the ground, or to serve or minister, and usually with a sacrifice. And so, were those ways of showing devotion to God? Yes, but they literally mean it. And they're never used in a metaphorical sense unless they're specifically said. Your spiritual act of worship, or people who worship God in spirit, in truth. It adds that. The word itself does not have that connotation, that metaphorical connotation, unless it is given. And we said then that the focus of this time, what even is more important, is the focus of this Sunday morning assembly or gathering is not to even the English version, to adore God, to show devotion to God. Now, we do that in things that we do, certainly, but the biblical focus, and we saw passage after passage, is to edify and encourage one another. That's what we're to do at this time. Even the things we do that show devotion to God, those are done, our prayers, the singing, you could say that, they're done to edify each other. That is what God wants to happen during this time. Well, I'm guessing that was a little surprising to you. It was surprising to me. But it's hard to argue with when you look at all the verses there. Well, today there's another element that when you look at it, it's pretty clear, but it is totally missed. Totally missed. And that's participation in this Sunday gathering. Again, the purpose of the weekly gathering is not to worship, adore God. It is to edify each other, which sometimes, again, takes place through things that do adore and show devotion to God. But here's the one key. The biblical purpose is not that one person or a few people edify everyone else. It is that we edify each other, which means that includes all Christians in the gathering. We're to have some part in edifying each other in ways that fit us, as God has made us. 1 Corinthians 14 is a key passage for this. It says, "What then, brothers, when you come together, each one has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Let all things be done for building up." Now, some of those actions have ceased, and I'll probably get to a time of teaching on that. We'll look at tongues and revelations and such. But the principle that verse conveys remains. That everyone in the church came with something to contribute, something to share that had that effect of edifying each other, building each other up, encouraging each other. Colossians 3 says something similar. Let the word of God dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. So you see that idea, teaching and admonishing one another. Some have the gift of teaching and will be the primary teachers. That was true in the New Testament, and it continues. But look what it says. There's an aspect of us all teaching and admonishing one another. Something we're all to do. And I've said before, I think the reason for the focus on songs is songs are easy to remember. You know, sometimes to the detriment of songs. You get something stuck in here. I've had that recently. Like, oh, I didn't even pick that when it just came on, and then I can't get it out. Yeah, well, you know, in a good way. If it's a song that has, you know, definitely that quotes a Bible passage or something, you get that stuck in here, that's a good thing. Use that, it's saying, to encourage, admonish, teach one another. And that goes back to, even our singing is not ultimately to God. It's for each other. It's to help us. Now, among Christians in general, I don't think anyone would disagree. Church attendance today, and who knows how long that goes back, but definitely today, is sporadic. Well, think about it. If the purpose is to worship God, that's being done whether I go to church or not, isn't it? You know, Sunday mornings for worshiping God, well, the rest of them can take care of that. I don't need to be there. If the purpose is to be edified, then I do need to be part of it. Now, you can benefit from watching at home. I mean, you can maybe even do something on your own if you weren't watching a service, you know, which became popular during COVID and such. You know, read your Bible, you be edified. I think we'd agree it's more effective in person. But when you add this other part, if the purpose is also for each of us to edify, well, then you have to be here. If you're going to participate in edifying others, you need to be present. And again, COVID exposed this hidden truth of modern worship services. You don't really need to be here for a modern worship service. For what it is, you don't need to be here. You can watch it at home, and you know, you might miss out on some small talk, but you can sing right along. You can follow and study. You can even take your own communion if you want. You do all that at home on your own. And I noticed after, you know, COVID passed and some people sort of got used to it, like, I sort of like this, you know, watching it on TV in my pajamas. I'm going to become a pajama disciple or whatever you want to call that there. Well, you kept seeing this verse. It got used a lot before, but it definitely got used after COVID. Hebrews 10, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some. You know, it just gets often, you know, don't neglect to meet together. You know, how often do you see that? Maybe on Facebook or something. And especially, again, after COVID, when people got out of the habit, you saw that verse. It was quoted left and right, but it was that part of the verse that was quoted, and at least what I usually see, it leaves out what the whole passage shows is the purpose of meeting together. Hebrews 10, the entire passage says, let us consider how to stir one another to love and good works. That's that edifying. That's building one another up. Stir up one another. You know, encourage, prod a little bit, you know, poke a little bit. Come on. To get people to love, to show love in tangible ways and do good works. Not neglecting to meet together, because you can't participate in helping others if you're not there. As is the habit of some. But encouraging one another. All the more as you see the day drawing near. It begins the passage and ends the passage. It's not just show up. But that's what usually gets quoted. Just show up. That's what God wants you to do. Don't neglect meeting together. Dirty, rotten sinner. Show up. It makes it clear there. Show up to encourage. Show up to edify, to stir one another up. That's why we're to be here. Well, as I was going through this lesson, I thought about, you know, the elephant in the room. A couple of them we're going to get to. But one of them is, you see all these each others and one another's. Well, what about that subject that, you know, this group of churches is, you know, probably it's easier to talk about than some, but what about women? We're talking about participating in worship. Well, there's some verses that seem to, all right, What about women? 1 Corinthians 14. Paul writes, as in all the churches of the saints, the women should keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be in submission. As the law also says, if there is anything they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. What's that mean? Does that mean from the moment you enter the doors that women aren't even to utter a word? Sounds like it, doesn't it? Women aren't to speak in church. The moment you walk through that, definitely the moment you walk through the doors of the sanctuary. Like, from that point on, women shouldn't say a word. Woo!
Watch it, Jerry.
Yeah. Is that what that means? Well, we'd all say absolutely not. That's ridiculous. Well, some things that we may think we know are just as ridiculous. We just don't know it yet. Let's see what this means. Go back to 1 Corinthians, and again, I don't want to flip back and forth, so it's up here. That same letter, even, not just the same author, the same letter a few chapters earlier, 1 Corinthians 11, says, every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head, but every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head. Now, head coverings, here's another can of worms. The passage does have a principle of headship leadership that is not cultural. And you remember I've said before, the test is the principle linked to something that's unchanging? And if you look up above, I don't have it, verse 3, it talked about Christ is the head of every man. That's unchanging. It's not like, well, Christ was the head of every man in the year, 0 or 33, but he's not now. No, he still is. So if the principle is tied to something unchanging, then the principle hasn't changed. If it's not tied to that, like greet each other with a holy kiss, well, it's cultural. Well, this one has a little bit of both. It has the fact that, the roles of men and women, but head coverings were a sign of that in that culture, of a woman's submission. And in that culture, if they didn't do it, she was not being submissive in the way God says it should be. And again, there's other passages that talk about mutual submission, all of us, everyone to God. Now, one thing that does mean, if you are in a culture where head coverings still mean that, then as a woman, you should still wear them. But in our culture, it doesn't mean that. So there isn't the obligation to wear them. There's no one that looks at a woman without, a head covering in general in our culture and says, what's going on there? But here's the point I'm getting from this. I had to deal with that. Both men and women prayed and prophesied. Look at what he's saying. He's talking about, one should have their head covered, one shouldn't in that culture. But look what he says. Every man, this is how you do it. Every woman, while you're praying or prophesying. And the context is in the weekly gathering. So Paul is saying here, women prayed and prophesied in the weekly gathering. Well, then 3 chapters later, he says women aren't allowed to speak. I know I'm forgetful sometimes. You forget what he said a few chapters earlier? I don't think so. I think this is what it is. First of all, we talked about this a little bit last week, but prophesy, I think we're pretty familiar with praying. Prophesy means literally to speak forth. To speak forth. It can be foretelling the future. That God gives a prophecy, here's what's going to happen in the future, like the messianic prophecies of the Bible, or others. God says, hey, I'm going to bring in exile. This is going to happen. He even says, this country is going to come in and conquer you. It can be a general message from God. It still comes direct from God, but it's more of what we would call like a sermon. The miraculous gift of prophecy is one that comes directly from God. And you remember, when the church started, there was no New Testament. The letters hadn't been written, let alone circulated to all the churches. So they would receive, if someone in that church had the miraculous gift of prophecy, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, maybe next week it comes up. If an apostle had laid hands on someone, they would receive a direct prophecy from God. Seems to also have the general meaning, though, of just speaking about God. A testimony. That would be a prophecy. May even include an aspect of singing and playing instruments. 1 Samuel might allude to that. But let's look at this. In this context, prophesying may be miraculous, but praying is never miraculous. Praying is just praying. So there's no reason to limit prophesying here to just miraculous prophecy. And so the point I'm making is, this passage makes it clear, men and women in the assembly were praying out loud, were prophesying out loud. It was okay for women to do. Not just okay aloud, it's even encouraged. When you come together, everyone do this. So, go back to 1 Corinthians 14. What does Paul mean? What's he prohibiting in 1 Corinthians 14? Well, if you start earlier, you see, verse 29 says, "Let 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let the others weigh what is said." What's that mean? See, does this conform to what we know of God's revelation up to this point? If a revelation is made to another sitting there, let the first be silent. For you can all prophesy one by one, so that all may learn and be encouraged. And the spirits of prophets are subject to prophets. For God is not a God of confusion, but of peace. And here's where we picked up. As in all the churches, the women should keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be in submission, as the law also says. If there is anything they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. Here's what it seems. Women were allowed to prophesy during the gathering. We just saw that in chapter 11, right? Women were allowed to speak forth about God. But they're not to weigh what is said in the gathering versus at home. The apparent meaning is they're not to, if there was some issue with the person and a discussion started, the women weren't to be involved in that discussion. The men were to lead. Does this conform to what the Bible says, what we know of God's revelation? That discussion, that debate, was to be held by men. Does that make sense? So again, anyone, men or women, can pray and prophesy. If there's some debate, someone prophesies, says something like, how does that fit with this? And suppose a woman could raise that question, but the debate on whether it does, that's to be among men. Which goes back to teaching was to be done. And at that point, you're getting beyond just saying something into, all right, how does it fit teaching, dissecting it? How does it fit with God's revelation? And we're going to talk about that next week, the roles of men and women when it comes to leadership and teaching.
If there's anything they desire to learn, let them ask their cats at home. Their husband. Their husbands at home. No, some women don't have a husband at home.
Right, and there's others who could do that. Out of that setting, and the thing is, there's always going to be exceptions. And here's what we have to realize is, the Bible talks like we talk in terms of some things are meant to be taken literally and some things are, let them ask their husbands at home. Does that mean if they don't have a husband, they can't ask anyone? No. You can ask someone, but out of that setting is what it is. Out of that church setting, that's where any discussion about that's to happen. Now, one thing about this, one point is, what was the potential problem with allowing everyone to participate, to speak in gatherings?
Get out of control.
And get out of control, and that's why it says there, one person at a time. If God gives another person a prophecy, you stop, and the first person stops. But if you have this, weigh what is said. What's that saying? What's a potential problem? What's that? An argument. Someone might say something that is questionable. And I think that's one of the potential issues people have, potential problems. Well, if we start letting everybody talk in church, who knows what that crazy guy's going to say? They had that same issue back here. And it wasn't just the women. It wasn't like if a woman says something, when a woman prophesies, weigh what is said. No, woman or a man, weigh what is said. Does it fit with? And some things would be just clearly obvious, and some things might not. Yeah.
Were the women educated back then?
Not to the degree the men were.
Right.
But here's one of the things, not to the degree initially, but just even this, let a woman ask and receive that education at home. Women, and in other passages we're going to see, women are not permitted to teach men, but men are permitted to teach men and women. they did get educated in the church setting more than they got educated in the outside the church. So in that sense, like in the culture, no, but in church, they did. They were part of the learning of the doctrine, the apostles' doctrine.
Do we know how they were assembled? Like in the synagogue, they were separate. The men would sit on one side and the women on the other. And we know that there were, in the Old Testament, there were prophetesses that were basically in the temple to teach women. So it's very possible that they're separating for this, that the women were teaching the women. And now we saw, and of course then you have the prophesying very often being singing, because you got Deborah and you got Miriam leading the entire congregation of Israel in a song, when they would not have been allowed to get up and teach, but they led the entire congregation in song.
And that's a little bit like that verse that says, teach and admonish one another with psalms, hymns, and spiritual song. There's a degree of teaching that goes on there. I'm going to get into more of this next week. But yeah, there's a degree of teaching, anything, something new. If a woman said, whatever, the first communion plate was made in 1951. Well, did you know that? If you didn't know it, she just taught you something. Now, I would say this, definitely the Old Testament, the synagogues, but once it spread out to the Gentile world, I think things got very different than they did in the Jewish setting. And that became the predominant setting of Christendom.
So how do you know that this verse right here is not cultural? The whole women not speaking thing. How do you know this is not a cultural piece as well?
The deeper, there's going to be, again, I'm going to get into it next week. I had to figure out ways to divide these up, or else we'd still be here from last week. That's where you see things that are linked to, principles that are made in general about women teaching and leading. And so that's what I would say. This principle here the principle itself doesn't have an expiration. And so Paul, let the prophets speak and speak one at a time. And so his response to it, to limit, like this part of the passage goes on, but this part doesn't, wouldn't make sense.
And Paul actually ties it back to Garden 1.
Yeah, in the next passage we'll look, when he talks about women not teaching in Timothy, he ties it back to Adam and Eve. So again, it's very clear, women are not prohibited from speaking universally, generally across the board in a church assembly. Still trying to get the terms right. He says, women pray and prophesy. He says, each one bring a hymn. But it seems when it gets into this part of, debating biblical things and weighing, not just even the, questioning, but weighing. If this is in accordance with the apostles' doctrine, this is not. Women weren't to be in on that decision. We're going to get to it next week. Why, why men, why women? But even some of it this week. 1 Timothy 2. Here's another passage. And this is the one that brings out Adam and Eve, and we're going to look at more next week. But this one, let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. Well, again, you got 1 Corinthians 11:5, where Paul allowed women to pray and prophesy, so they are allowed to speak. We've established that, right? They are allowed to pray and prophesy in church. Here he says, let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. Well, what's he saying? 1 Timothy 2, verse 1, that word quietly. First of all, then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and all who are in high positions. There's a whole lesson in itself, praying for the government officials, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. Now, quiet there obviously doesn't mean not talking. Pray that we would live a life where none of us ever talks. Now, there might be times you would pray for that. Everyone around me just shut up. But he's not saying, obviously, quiet. He's talking about without turmoil, like peace and quiet type of thing. Not argumentative. Now, you might go, okay, why is Paul just telling women? Hey, come on, no turmoil. He doesn't just tell women. 1 Timothy 2, verse 8 says, I desire then that in every place that men should pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or quarreling. He knows they can get into it also, and he told them. Well, what about the phrase with all submissiveness? Again, in the context to the elders who would be leading the teaching, typically. And again, the principle applies to men who aren't elders as well. Hebrews 13 says, obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls, and those who will give an account. So both things that he says there to women, conduct yourselves without turmoil. He says that to men. And learn in all submissiveness. He says in general, that's true of men as well when it comes to elders. So it is not prohibiting women from speaking in church. We're going to look next week. Women are prohibited from teaching men. And we'll see that. It comes out of that same passage. So every person, men and women, were not only allowed, but were expected to contribute to edifying each other. There were some restrictions on women, but a lot of opportunity. A lot of opportunity. Questions there beyond what we've already asked?
It sounds to me like what, and I'm just turning this over in my head, It sounds to me like what it is they don't want women in conflict or confrontation of thought. In other words, a debate they want between men. Then when women can contribute as much as they want.
Yeah, and I don't think, again, it wasn't something that was always an issue that everyone, weigh what is said. Well, sometimes it's just very obvious. Jesus is Lord. It's not like, okay, let's hold a debate on, is Jesus Lord?
Yeah.
But every once in a while someone is going to say something, and you're like, yeah, how's that?
But because here you get like, okay, here's a man and woman, and this woman's teaching something that another man somewhere, decides, well, that ain't right. And so he comes back on the woman whose husband is, now you see conflict.
There definitely could be. I mean, that's in general, and so, the broader principle of love one another, of bear with one another,
right.
Would follow there of how you're to do these things.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting idea that there were questions that came up. When you let even men prophesy.
It sounds to me like that's what they're doing. It's a door out of conflict.
Definitely trying to avoid that. I don't know if that'd be the only reason, because again, they're telling the men to weigh what is said without conflict, so you could just tell the women, well, join in, just don't have conflict. But it goes beyond that in saying, all right, if there becomes a debate, that's to be conducted by men.
There comes a point in time where the building one another up in a group can be almost counterproductive if it's just wrangling and, just out of control and.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Get to the point, it's like the old saying, a foolish man can ask a question that 10 wise men can't answer. So it's like, well, we need to talk about that at home because this is going to take up, 2 or 3 weeks or something to chase all this out.
Yeah, I mean, in this setting, again, I think next week we'll look at why are women, prohibited from teaching and leading. What's God's answer for that? In this one, as it talks about weighing things when there's a dispute, it's what, like one of the verses hinted at. God's main, when you look in 1 Corinthians, like the main focus is to have this unified spirit, to not have divisions. That's what, for instance, it starts from the very beginning. I was baptized, I follow Paul, I follow Peter, I follow Jesus, division. rich and poor, division, all kinds of it. And so the main focus is to maintain order and, peace, just as it says, no turmoil in the gathering. Because you don't get anything. No one's edified when there's turmoil. And this is what he's talking about here.
The whole context of Christianity is we are part of the household of God. And so a well-ordered, well-functioning home life is really the model that should be experienced in the household of God as we are assembled together. Is that household
There's a lot of overlap, yeah.
mutual submission, your husbands.
And I think that's one reason when we get into leaders in the church, I think that's why that principle is there. One reason. All right, let me do this. Let's get back to the general idea, because this whole sermon is about participation in the Sunday morning gatherings. But the obvious, issue, all right, what about pastors that talk about women, again, on the surface, that when women aren't even to speak? When you walk in the doors, you can't say another word till you walk out? Obviously not. And I'm not, all of this. This is what I think, and I'm open to discussion and debate and how it works. But the general principle is definitely there. 1 Corinthians 14, let 2 or 3 prophets speak. Paul's talking. Prior to that, in verse 27, he said, if any speak in a tongue, let there be only 2 or 3 at most, and each in turn, and let someone interpret. Again, tongues have ceased. We can talk about that later. But the point, there's 2 or 3 more people. 1 Corinthians 11, men and women are described as praying and prophesying. And then 1 Corinthians 14, what then, brothers, when you come together, each one has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Let all things be done for building up. All of that's in addition to a time of teaching. But there would be teachers who had some specific passage they were going over. So how many, you take all those in, how many participants do you view from that in a Sunday morning gathering? Many. You got 2 or 3 prophets, you got 2 or 3 tongue speakers, you got everyone, supposed to come with a revelation, a hymn, a song, encourage one another with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Then you got a teacher.
And you have interpreters.
Yeah, you got interpreters back then with the tongues. There were a lot of people. And remember, it wasn't like there were 100 people there to start with. It's what could fit in. Now, I assume people may have had some larger houses than others, but still, the largest room in a house then, how many people's it holding? The first known church building, quote unquote, that we know of is around the year 230, and that was a house that they took out the wall so they could have a bigger room. So there weren't a lot of people in the group that could fit in that room. And we just said it sure looks like a lot of people were participating. Well, contrast that. How many people truly participate in a modern worship service today?
The volunteers and the paid staff.
The ones who, do some, Todd got to be there, the other Todd got to speak, I'm speaking. Kim did the announcements, and that's because we're encouraging other people to do announcements.
And she was a woman.
Prayers coming later, Didn't mention announcements in the Bible, but I suppose you can make the case, if you were Church of Christ and silence forbids, we couldn't even have announcements. You just have the bulletin board. We're on the top edge of things. In a normal church service, worship service, you wouldn't have that many. It's just totally contrary to the biblical, the New Testament pattern. You had a lot of people. I'd say, would you agree the majority of people in a New Testament gathering contributed in some way? Seems like they did. Certainly the verses that said, each one of you come. Doesn't mean every single person, I'm sure, every, week, spoke. But he's making the point. Everyone's invited. Everyone, not just invited, encouraged, and maybe even beyond that. Well, I had someone talk about once when I was, wanted this type of interaction, and I remember her response was, we come to church to hear a sermon. Are you ready for another surprise? All right. The word sermon is not in the Bible at all. Preach is in the Bible, but it doesn't mean what you think, or better, it's not used when you think. Preach is never used of assembly speaking in the New Testament. Yeah. The Greek word charisson, translated to preach or proclaim, often preach the gospel. It is never used in terms of when the local group gathered together, someone in that group preached to the people in that group. Craig Evans has this to say: all of the examples of carousing refer either to gospel proclamation to the lost or impenitent, or to announcing something of a secular nature. So the word could be just making an announcement. It is never used in the sense of preaching to a local congregation. So you get what that means. In the church assemblies, no one got up and preached. What words are used of the local assembly? Exhort, or encourage, and teach. Those are the words that are used. What's the purpose that is cited? The purpose is to build up or edify, to strengthen, or to encourage. In other words, all of those have that idea of leading Christians to become better Christians, to grow and mature. And all of these were two-way conversations, which preaching typically isn't. I'm the exception there if you call it preaching, and I'm trying to get away from calling it that. But that's not what it's called. You think more, the New Testament assembly, the interaction during the teaching part is more like Sunday school than what we're used to in a worship service. I remember, again, when I introduced this idea of interactive back and forth, I remember someone said, that's what Sunday school's for. Well, that's interesting because Sunday school started in 1751. It's a little while after the Bible in England, and at first it was literally school on Sunday for kids who had to work in the factories or the mines 6 days a week. So this was their only chance to get an education and rise above that. So Sunday school, that's not where it is. Now, what are the problems with the preaching approach? Well, first of all, most listeners become passive spectators. And then you know what's worse? Preachers complain about it. How many posts do I see on Facebook? God wants an army, not an audience. Well, we've been teaching you to be an audience for how many 100 years? And then we complain about it. Well, it's our fault.
One of my major professors, somebody asked him, what do you get out of it? Because he was so learned theologically and biblically and philosophically. He was what would you get out of going to the assembly meeting? And he said, well, a good nap. He was known to be honest. Yeah,
well, and that's part of it too. Personal development is hindered. Only one person is studying and sharing. If you know that you're coming to have something to say, you might do some studying. Evangelistic emphasis thwarts edification. Here's one. This would be called blasphemy by some, almost literally. An emphasis on evangelism in this service, in this time, thwarts edification. But I tell you, I can remember reading books. Every sermon is supposed to end at the foot of the cross. Well, maybe every sermon, that's true. In the worship assembly, my word, in the church assembly, they didn't have sermons. Yeah, preaching is to end at the foot of the cross, but not this time here. Do we have evangelism was done outside the gathering? That's where Paul went and preached to, people at Mars Hill or in a synagogue or something like that. He preached to them because they didn't know anything. Teachers taught in the Sunday assembly. Now, is there a different dynamic now in audience? I don't know, but here's the thing. Edification provides opportunity still for non-believers. If someone is not a Christian and they're hearing the things that they're being taught from the Bible, they're still picking up a lot. By the way, altar calls, this idea at the end of the service, you have this call that comes, an altar. not in the New Testament. Again, it was their living room. Didn't have an altar. But altar calls, as we know of them today, were at the end of a service. You say something, or come forward, raise your hand. Those began in the late 1700s. Now, it doesn't mean they're sinful, but again, it was not the New Testament. To not have an altar call, an invitation, is not unbiblical, anti-biblical.
So I'm a little confused, but we have to have a time that we do go out and proclaim to the lost.
Yes.
And then they have a time of baptism, and then they're supposed to join a family of Christians, correct?
Correct.
So what we are supposed to be doing then, because maybe what the churches originally set this all up for was to teach the lost, and we're supposed to bring in the lost so that they can hear proclaiming, but we're really should be out there proclaiming.
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you, and even back then, if you could get someone who wasn't a Christian to come into the assembly, there are going to be things said. And it even says, when Paul talks about, if someone sees, and now what do they see? I used it in the worship one. What do they see in Corinthians? Where the person is going to worship God, and we said that literally means fall down on his face, not like, ooh. Yeah, but what they see that causes the person to do that? I'm blanking. I don't know, but that is saying, there were non-believers. It was possible for a non-believer to be in a Sunday morning assembly. But it wasn't something you counted on. And again, it's become the focus of churches today that's sort of what we count on. We do everything we can to get unbelievers into our Sunday morning assembly, and then we, make sure every sermon ends at the foot of the cross. That was not the biblical New Testament pattern. If someone came in the Sunday morning assembly, awesome. But there's going to be teaching going on for believers. Can a non-believer get something from that? Absolutely. What is going to happen, mass evangelism, is going to be someone like Paul or an evangelist, that's their gift, is going to go out and speak, preach, a one-way conversation. Doesn't mean no one can ask questions, but it's very largely a proclamation because the people hearing it don't know anything. Versus in teaching, you guys all know a lot about the Bible. So we're interacting, Personally, now, not everyone, it doesn't mean that, okay, the only way to evangelize is it has to be some large setting, because you have other witnessing would be me and you in a coffee shop, or me and you at work, or in our backyard or something. So there's not going to be a sermon, a preaching, but there will be a focus on evangelizing just in the form of what we would call witnessing. Does that make sense? Yeah. In the New Testament Sunday morning gathering, that was not the main focus. And you see that when we looked in those passages, it was always edify, encourage, build one another up. It was not create converts.
That's what we're here on Sunday for, is to be strengthened and encourage each other to go out on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, to look for all those opportunities to talk to people about Jesus Christ.
Right. That, and just to encourage to live the Christian life too. I mean, it's not like everything about the Christian life is just evangelism. That is a part of discipleship. But do we come here to encourage, edify, or build one another up to be disciples, which are people who follow Jesus and make disciples?
But we can't sell ourselves short too. We all can encourage each other to want to do that. To drive toward that.
Right. That's part of the encouragement. That's part of the building up. How do you do it? How do you motivate yourself to do it? Continuing with disadvantages of preaching. The preacher / pastor is elevated, usually physically. But also you looked at it, he's the one worth listening to, versus someone else. There's a lot of people that have good things to say. Again, when you get a teaching environment, it comes out when other people can do it. Huh?
We're paying him to do it.
Well, yeah, you're paying him. He needs to be the one that does it. The people are by nature demoted. They're waiting to be fed, and it perpetuates this priest-laity division, which we're going to look at next week. So what did this look like? Again, there was definitely mutual teaching. Teach and admonish each other. during singing as well as praying and prophesying, but there were specific teachers. Don't get this wrong. Romans 12 talks about having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them. If prophecy in proportion to our faith, if service in our serving, the one who teaches in his teaching. There were people who had the gift of teaching. Ephesians 4, he gave the prophets, the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds, and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for the building up of the body of Christ. So there are people who are more gifted by nature to teach. Often those teachers were elders. 1 Timothy 5, let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. The double honor is one, just the honor that you should get in being an elder, should be honored by people. The double honor is they get paid. For the scripture says, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain, the laborer deserves his wages. So he's saying, the people who were elders, who also put in time to teach, those people did deserve to be paid. Most likely, there were multiple teachers at a church, certainly if there were multiple people gifted to do so. There was not one, and definitely the system we have, of a preacher. We're going to bring in a preacher from Arkansas to be, a guy from Arkansas to be our next preacher. Didn't have anything like that back then. He grew up from the congregation. The practice of there just being one, where's that come from? I don't know if it comes from, one priest in the Catholic Church, one head priest or whatever. I don't know, but it's not the biblical pattern. There were multiple teachers in a church. All right, so let's bring this home today. Again, observation, reflection, application. Observation. What happened? What was said? Well, we observed that in New Testament gatherings, it included input from everyone. There was a time of one person leading in the study of the Word, but that was teaching, not preaching. It was interactive, not one way. Okay, reflect on that. What's the principle? Well, the majority of people in the local church should contribute during the gathering. Contribute in some way.
No monologue.
No, just monologue. Yeah. The time of dedicated teaching. So two things. One, there should be contributions, not just in the time of teaching where we go back and forth, but there should be other things where someone comes and, to the service and says, hey, I read this verse this past week and it really spoke to me. Here it is. I heard this song. Wow, I was feeling really down and this person called and encouraged me and, I want to just share that. Maybe encourage you. They were to come bringing things like that. Testimonies about what God had done in their lives. So the application. You tell me, what do we do with this? And one thing we'll do, I'm going to start, priming the pump. I think what I'm going to do is after next month's potluck, we'll really sit down whiteboard official and how do we implement unity and fellowship and praying and all these things. But just start thinking about it. How do we, especially New Testament gatherings took places in houses, so the number was limited. The number was limited. Several can still contribute in a church building setting up to a point. You got 500 people, it's probably going to be tough. Interactive teaching can still happen in a church building and setting. What are some ways to deal with a larger group and still get the interaction?
Barn.
A barn?
Barn.
Okay.
Well, you see, I've been to a lot of wedding receptions where it ended up in the barn.
Okay. What's that give you?
The space.
Besides the smell. No, see, we're saying here the space is actually a detriment.
And you're at the person's home that doesn't have the size that is required for the group.
Yeah, see,
So
the bigger you get, that's sort of the problem. How can we have this interaction when there's more than, and there's no way to know how many people were in a New Testament. Have you ever seen anything like?
Well, I'm not.
Once you got past the,
I've done math once or twice. If you look at the church where they had the first appointed deacons, you needed 7 deacons to feed the widows.
but
That's
did
a
they?
few widows.
Again, you got to remember when it talks about the church in Jerusalem, does that mean every Christian in Jerusalem met in one house?
No, I think, well, there was probably more than that, fewer or more than one, but I think there were some that were bigger. They would have been outdoors. If you got like the Amish do, they build buildings for that purpose.
Right,
And-
they do now.
And they'll hold, I've been in a few of them, they'll hold probably 100 people. But if you just look at that, and if you consider, Paul said that those who preach the gospel should live with the gospel. If you're gonna tithe, and then you're gonna support one man,
There
on a
needs to be at
tenth,
least
you're gonna need
10 families.
10 families giving a tenth to have that guy have an equal share.
Yeah,
So those are some basics.
see, I think that's a good
I think
one.
you're getting out of just, thinking of in your living room. Certainly, I've seen plenty of churches started in living rooms, but it should grow, shouldn't it?
It should grow, but I think, again, there was definitely a limit to the size. Now, obviously, people would have different size living rooms. I mean, they do now. So some of the wealthier would have bigger ones. And again, the first church building was a house where they tore down the wall. That's a good point. But even there, you have to remember how we use church and they use church. When we talk about the church, when we talk about Corbin Corners Church, Christ, we're it. But when they talk about the church in Ephesus, I don't think it was just one specific place that was the church of Ephesus. I think it was all the Christians in Ephesus. Some of them met at Joe's house, and some of them met at Sam's house, and some of them met here, wherever. But I think they were still considered themselves at that point a church.
So, and then you could do like some of them, I know where my brother's at, that Sunday morning, they have 3 services, 1,200 people or so. But Sunday afternoon and evening, they have small groups that are overseen by the eldership. And have small groups all around the place. I don't see, I think you're partial. I think you're probably right on the preacher. I think like Timothy is an evangelist. I think that's a short term to a church. I think that's a short term thing. I think this 20, 30 years in one church as an evangelist, that don't really make any sense. I think you go in, you set the church in order, you ordain elders, you go on to the
And then you move on to the next one. Yeah, did a church have an evangelist? That's a good point. That stayed at that church. Because once you got started, then it was the job of the people to witness, to evangelize, what we call. But it doesn't mean you necessarily go out and you're the person who can preach in a big setting.
When I was a young Christian, I started at Antwerp Church, and they went out 2 by 2, like an elder and a teacher, and set up sessions at people's houses for unbelievers.
Right.
To teach them.
Right. And that's where, again, you're going outside of the church assembly to do something like that. One thing, because it's just about leaving and it's almost gone, can I pull it back? It was there for a second. Oh, it's gone. Boy, I hope it wasn't good. Oh, one thing. Lisa saw this, with small groups. Definitely one approach to this has been, you have your big Sunday morning gathering, and then you have small groups. One problem with that is, and I debated whether to have a sermon lesson focused on that. I've been doing this a long time. The priority, obviously this is the main event of the church week. You can't deny it. More focus, attention is given it, more money is spent on this. Well, it's hard. I mean, in reality, in experience, if a church gets 20% of their people to go to small groups, they're going to be asked to teach a seminar because it just doesn't happen. So how do you change that? And I think one is to change, is this the main event? Acts 2:42 is not talking about the Sunday morning service. It's talking about their day-to-day routine once they became Christians. Yeah. And if the day-to-day routine is the emphasis, well then of course you're going to get together when we all can fit in a room, on Sunday morning. So we got to change that mentality a little bit. Another thing that I saw, Lisa was at a Church for Lifewise recently, they have Sunday school after the morning assembly, and one of the Sunday school classes goes over what the sermon was. So you're right there. I would take it even further, and I think one Sunday we'll try this. You know, maybe I'll see what happens. I have to at least say one Sunday, so you aren't going to run me out of town. But I'll have a shorter time like this, and then we'll break up into a few groups. And I'll have leaders, and I'll prepare the things to talk about. You know, I'll prepare the people who lead the groups, but I'll also, it won't be just up to them. I'll say, here's the things to follow up. So that you go from this larger group where we have more interaction than most churches, but where you can really interact, and try that. The other thing I'll say when we talk about participation, you know, especially now, we should have opened, you know, hopefully the floodgates are open when, you know, for time to pray, whether it's out loud or, you know, after the biblical announcements, and you're asked to pray, all kinds of hands should be going up. You know, Kim's hardest part should be, oh, well, I got to pick one of you 10 volunteers. Participate. You know, just be eager. Isn't it great that we get a chance to do that?
Yeah.
Do you really want to be an audience? Like, you really want to just come? Because then it is like, how much do I get out of it if I'm not invested in it?